Hello everyone, my name's Albin Clark and I'd like to talk to you about a piece of data and how I returned to that data and how I thought with the absences. So what wasn't there? That was my starting point, which is an unusual way to start some thinking. So in my thinking here, I'm using the idea of return, which is from Karen Barard's thinking, and I'm returning to diagrams of data that I've made in previous studies. And I'm wondering if when I return to those parts of data, it's a really lovely springboard for thinking about these methodologies that I'm using. So I'm using post-human, feminist and new materialist methodologies to think with. And in that frame, in my field of study, which is early childhood education, children and teachers, I move aside from them as my centre of my inquiry and look to their relationship with the non-human and more than human world. So it's flattened the ontology. So in that theoretical view, suddenly my thinking becomes more multiple. I'm appreciating the entanglement between things. It's a shifting, dynamic process, and I'm looking for difference as much as I'm looking for similarity. So it's a way of thinking about the world that takes into account all those connections and interconnections and interactions that are going on between the human and all the things around them. So I'd developed a set of data diagrams in a previous study, and I found diagramming to be something really helpful at first. And the diagrams were ways for me to navigate and to think about ideas of complexity and diffraction and relatedness. And I found the diagrams very generative. I could see events right across the data sets. They helped me to think about what my study was, which was about documentation, so how teachers observe children's playful learning and see that documentation as something active, something with agency, but it also brought confusion and uncertainty. So my research really this time has gone back to look more at the confusion and uncertainty that the diagramming brought as a way to start thinking. So, for example, Cara Taylor's work's been really helpful to me in thinking with uncertainty and thinking about this, settling back, the situatedness of knowing, of knowledge generation, and that idea of noticing, turning to slow down, notice what's around you. Because I'm generally quite a fast person, but when I've come across Carol Taylor's work, that idea of stopping to notice, stop, pause, look around. When I went back to the data diagrams that I made, I looked more carefully at them and sort of sat with them a bit more, and that was my starting point really. Maggie McClaw's work's been really helpful in my thinking here, and she talks about the idea of what lacks the comfort of classification. So what lacked comfort? When I first used these diagrams, I was looking all the time for connectedness and relatedness and mentally classifying things in my head. But when I returned to them, I was thinking more about what was hard to think with, as my starting point. And Christina McRae's work here, she talks about the stickiness of data. And again, that draws back to Maggie McClaw. And she also talks about stuttering, what stutters the thinking process, what sticks to you, so those ideas are things that I've played with. And this image you can see here of the shapes and colours gives you a sense of the ways in which I approach diagramming practice. So here you can see a range of the diagrams that I used in my previous study. I'm not going to try and attempt to describe them here because my focus is in what I did with them methodologically. But you can see that they're doing different things, and I found diagramming, mapping and visualising data was helpful. During my analytical process, it seemed to encompass those ideas of vital and post-humanist and this idea of assemblage, all those things I found really helpful. And then the point I really want to get to is what one thing was doing, which was these little squares here. This was the third diagram I made, and you can see here that the squares, and they represented stagnation, where data stopped, and that's what caught my attention. That little element really caught my attention. So when I looked at this voided shape, in more depth. And I thought of that as a micro event. I thought, what effect is that micro event causing? You know, and can I think of it as something beneficial and harmful at the same time? And this is Melanie Freeman's work here on diagrammatic thinking, which I found really helpful. So when I was looking at what was connected and related to each other and interacted with each other and flowed, and you know, the idea of connection, really, the void represented for me like this sort of black hole, this collapse of thinking, somewhere where I had nowhere to go. So Bowden and Gunnarson's 2020 paper was really helpful for me, because in that paper they talk about this idea of uncertainty and contradiction, you know, within methodological processes. So one contradiction of the void for me was this representation where thinking stops or disappears. So no thing is created. So when I returned to that data and looked at the nothing, I thought, well, can I transform that nothing into something, nothing into something, you know? And can that become a generative device for me? But it only became generative when I resisted the concrete idea to classify it. So I found tensions in a further generation of diagrams that confounded communication of thoughts, and the voided shape brings attention to the viscous nature of data that clings to and hangs around. So in as much as I can conclude through a methodological approach, the voided shape brings attention to the viscous nature, and I can't really offer a roadmap, but my contribution to diagramming practices brings attention to the stickiness of data that's returned to as something generative, and I posit that sticky data only becomes sticky if its long fibrous thoughts become further entangled into the perceiving body of the researcher self. So my message really is to let yourself become entangled and look for those moments in micro events of data which seem not to make sense, which seem to go nowhere, which seem to stop. And I think my question that I'm raising is could that be a starting point for thinking? You know, don't discard it. You know, it's almost like the bits that you screw up as a piece of paper and throw away. You know, no, that doesn't make sense. But actually, what doesn't make sense, if I get it out of the waste paper basket and I sort of unravel it might be something that I can think with. And I just want to acknowledge the helpfulness of the reading that I've done here, and draw attention to Maggie McClure's work, The Wonder of Data, Melanie Freeman's work on diagramming, which has been really helpful to me, McRae's paper, Strom's work, and Carol Taylor. Thank you for listening.